All right, so good evening. The class we're going to discuss tonight, the Torah portion. Tonight is the Torah portion of Vayichi. Vayichi is a very, very powerful Torah portion. It discusses the passing of Jacob, Yaakov Avinu, our ancestor, and it also discusses special blessings that Jacob gave to all of his children and his grandchildren, Ephraim and Manasseh, Joseph's two children, who we discussed last week. Somewhat, not that much at length, but we discussed a little bit about them last week. And in this week's Torah portion, as we shall soon see, it begins with an interesting blessing. And that is just before he begins on his deathbed to give blessings to his children, he seems to want to say something, and then he quickly digresses and then goes off to give the blessings without saying what he wanted to say. Kind of, he totally forgot, or something happened that he did not continue to talk about it. And so that's what we will focus on. What was that he wanted to discuss? But before we get to that, we're going to discuss a fundamental idea in Judaism. And that is, when we come to Judaism, they say the joke that how come the Jews have so many don'ts? Don't do this, don't do that, don't do the next thing. And everyone else, not necessarily. They seem to be doing just fine with doing whatever they want. So they say that when Moses came down from the mountain the first time with the two tablets, he saw what was going on with the golden calf, and he took the two tablets and threw them on the ground, smashed them, and went to rebuke the Jewish people. When people heard that there are pieces of stone, pieces of sapphire, no less, at the foot of the mountain that are God's pieces, they're pieces from the godly stones, everyone came running to grab a piece of stone. The Jewish people came away with all the pieces that said, don't, 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 don't. And the non-Jews came away with the pieces that said, do what you want. Jokes aside, that's how many people see Judaism. It's just a list of do's and don'ts. And then there's the other extreme, which are the extreme philosophers, the extreme philosophical aspect of it. They understand that there's a meaning behind it. They understand that there's reasons and there's a purpose for our creation and so on and so forth. Understanding the philosophical aspect of Judaism and the purpose behind it. Now, no matter where we stand on these two ends of the spectrum, like any other religion, but primarily in Judaism, we have this idea that there are fundamentals of our religion. Fundamentals of Judaism. What are those fundamentals of our religion? Whether we understand the depth of it, whether we see it superficially, there are fundamentals. What are those fundamentals? Sages throughout the ages have discussed it. There are certain ones that are quite basic and others that there's a debate among sages. What are the fundamentals? Everyone agrees, obviously, that whether we consider them fundamentals or not, kind of principles of faith or not, they are important. And they're a part of Torah and a part of Judaism that can never be separated. The question is it a principle of faith or not? And why that is important, we shall soon see. The most famous amongst these lists of fundamentals, lists of famous principles of faith is Maimonides' principles of faith. Maimonides' 13 principles of faith, which he enumerates in his commentary to the Mishnah in Tractate Sanhedrin, and placed quite precisely and concisely in many, many prayer books throughout many circles of Judaism. Many different sects within the Hasidic groups, the Ashkenazic, Sephardic, and so on. There are 13 principles of faith, but there's one that we will focus on, and that is the 12th principle of faith. We'll read it together inside in Maimonides. In Maimonides' words. And it's not just my internet acting up, seems to be my computer as well. Let's hold it while I get my act together. Sorry about that, or while the computer gets its act together. There we go. Okay. Nope, still got that green box around it. Do you see the entire image or do you see just some of the words? Anyone?
I see two columns,
You see two
Some of
columns.
the words.
one in Hebrew and one in English.
Do you see the full English or is the English cut off?
The English is cut off.
English is cut off. Yeah.
Okay, I have no idea why it's doing that. Let me try this one more time. Oh, now we got it. Okay.
Yeah.
There we go. Okay. Sorry about that. So in the Maimonides 13 Principles of Faith, Maimonides says as follows. The 12th principle, we believe and affirm that Mashiach will come. One should not think he is detained. Rather, if he should tarry, await him. Quoting the book of Habakkuk. One who doubts or belittles Mashiach's arrival denies the authority of the Torah, which explicitly promises his arrival in the story of Balaam, in the book of Numbers, and in Deuteronomy 30 in the Torah portion of Nitzavim. This is Maimonides explaining the 12th principle of faith. And then we have the way it's written in the prayer books. Short, concise, and a statement that we're all familiar with. I believe with perfect faith in the coming of Mashiach. Though he may tarry, I await his coming every day. Ani ma'amin be'emunah shlema b'viat HaMashiach va'af al pi sheyismamea im kol zeh achak eloi b'chol yom sheyaveh. You may be familiar with this statement, which has been made into many, many songs, and most famously, a song that the Jews in the concentration camps sang, some of them to their death, with their firm belief in the coming of Mashiach. And it's this fundamental principle that Maimonides states as a fundamental principle, which begs the question, why? Why is this such a fundamental principle of faith? Granted, his first one, which is, if I recall correctly, the belief in one God, belief in God. We understand why that's a principle, why that's a foundation of faith. Well, why is this a foundation of faith? In other words, we know that it's important. We know that it's in the Torah, as Maimonides just said earlier. It's part and parcel of the Torah. And so if we say it's not true, if we don't believe in it, if we don't await his coming, then we're going against the Torah. True, everyone agrees with that. But why is this a foundation? Why is this a principle of faith? What's so important about Mashiach's arrival and believing in Mashiach's arrival that Maimonides considers it as a principle of faith? And why is it so troubling when we say it's a principle of faith? The famous, Portuguese sage, the Abarbanel, who we quoted in the past, the 15th century sage. He was there at the time of the expulsion, the Inquisition, and he writes as follows, explaining the concept of a fundamental of faith, principle. The title principle Yesod is used for a foundation upon which the entire building rests. As in the verse, raise it to the foundation. So it only makes sense to use the title principle with regard to ideas that serve as the lifeline for other ideas, namely an idea without which those other ideas would cease to exist. Makes sense, sensible definition. If we're going to select certain aspects of Torah and say that these are principles of our faith, we're going to look for ideas that have broad impact. Let's look at the 8th principle that Maimonides mentions. The 8th principle, Maimonides explains, we believe that the entire Torah in our possession was given to us by God through Moses, our teacher, namely the Torah in its entirety is from God. And he continues, there is no difference between the verses and the sons of Ham were Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan, and his wife's name was Mehet Habel, the daughter of Matred, and the daughter of Mezav, and Timnah was a concubine too. And I am God your Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt, and hear, O Israel, God is our Lord, God is one. For it is all from God, it is all God's perfect Torah, pure, holy, and true. What Maimonides is explaining in this 8th principle is a very, very important point. And it's self-understood the impact it can have on many other laws of the Torah. What Maimonides is telling us is that we have to understand and believe, we believe that the entire Torah, every single word in the Torah, even those verses that seem not so exciting, not so theologically important, philosophically important, simple verses talking about Esau's family, talking about families of people that weren't such special holy people. Those are the first 3 verses that Maimonides quotes. Those 3 verses are as important and are directly from God, just as the most important verses that we deem important or we perceive as important of Hear, O Israel, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, the Shema Yisrael, or the first one of the 10 commandments, I am God, your Lord, who brought you out of the land of Egypt. Even though the latter 2 seem to be of greater importance, and the former ones we can say, you know what, those, they're not so important. They're not, that part of the Torah is not really from God. God forbid. Maimonides tells us that we believe it's a fundamental faith that every aspect of Torah is from God. Because you know what? If we believe that only some parts are divine and the other parts are not, then the entirety of Judaism falls apart. It's a foundation for the structure of Judaism. If we believe that partial Torah is divine, but the other part of the same Torah is not divine, then that removes the validity or the divinity of the entire Torah. And then the whole Torah falls apart, and then the whole structure, the whole foundation of the structure of Judaism falls apart. So this, the 8th principle, makes sense. We see why in the Abarbanel's sensible definition of explaining a foundation, a principle, would Maimonides choose to say that this is a principle of faith? But pray tell, how is Mashiach such a fundamental principle of faith? Say if I remove Mashiach from the equation, God forbid, but for argument's sake, would the entirety of Judaism fall apart? Would any aspect of Judaism fall apart? We still have to fulfill the commandments. We still have to put on tefillin every day, keep Shabbos, eat kosher. Everything is still standing. Why does Maimonides choose Mashiach as such an important principle of faith? And this question is such an important question, why the Rambam, as a matter of fact, had some detractors from some of his principles of faith. And again, it's important to explain that not that they felt that this wasn't important, not that they felt that Mashiach, God forbid, wasn't an aspect of Judaism. It's an important aspect of Judaism. It's in the Torah. We have to believe in the coming of Mashiach, and we know that Mashiach is coming at any moment. The question is it one of the 13 principles of faith? Is it a foundation of the faith? Or is it one of the 613 commandments? One of the important aspects of Torah, which are all equally important, just not a foundation. And one of the famous detractors was the Chassam Sofer. The Chassam Sofer, Rabbi Moshe Sofer, was a leading rabbinic authority in the 19th century. He was born in Frankfurt, and he wrote a book called the Chassam Sofer. And in it, in his responsa, he addresses Maimonides' 12th principle as follows. I cannot accept that believing in Mashiach is a fundamental principle of our faith, as if it's some sort of foundation that, if destroyed, will cause the entire edifice to fall. No one can say that if, hypothetically speaking, we were to be exiled forever, that gives us license to cast off the authority of heaven or change even the tiniest part of a rabbinic decree. It is not a foundation upon which anything needs to be built. Rather, the foundation of everything is to believe in the Torah, in which the final redemption is stated. As such, one who questions the redemption denies the primary underpinnings of our faith, namely the authority of Scripture. So the Chassam Sofer is telling us, yes, it's an integral part of Torah. And denying Mashiach or denying belief in awaiting its coming is denying an integral part of Torah, is denying, in his words, the primary underpinnings of our faith, namely the authority of Scripture. Koifer, he names him. But still he says that doesn't give us the understanding on why Maimonides chooses it to be a foundation. Why is it such an important foundation? To understand this idea, we will digress to the story in this week's Torah portion that I referenced earlier, the story of Jacob just before his passing. And that will give us somewhat of an understanding into this tremendous question. This week's Torah portion, the beginning of the blessings. Jacob had completed blessing his grandchildren, Joseph's two children, Manasseh and Ephraim, which is a story into itself. We discussed it at length a previous year. I don't recall exactly which year. And he moves on to blessing his children. And he gives them tremendous blessings with a lot of meaning in it, with a lot of depth, historical references, mystical meanings, and just overall powerful blessings. But just before he gives the blessings, something interesting happens. Here's the verse. Jacob called for his sons and said, "Gather and I will tell you what will happen to you at the end of days." The great reveal. He's about to tell us what happens at the end of days. He's about to tell his children, and it will be recorded in the Torah forever to the end of times, what will happen to us at the end of days. And nothing. Dud. Gather and listen, sons of Jacob, and listen to Israel, your father. And he continues to give them the blessings. So he gathers them once. He tells them, I'm going to tell you what's going to happen at the end of the days. And he tells them nothing. So he gathers them a second time. He says, listen, sons of Jacob, listen to Israel, your father. And he proceeds to teach them, to give them his blessings on his deathbed. Why? What's going on here? What was he going to tell them about what's going to happen at the end of days and the coming of Mashiach? And why did he suddenly not tell it to them? Did he have a moment of forgetfulness? I'm talking about Jacob here, who later proceeds to give such tremendous blessings. There must be something deeper at hand. And the Talmud fills us in to what exactly went on. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish, if you recall, we quoted him earlier this month. Rabbi Shimon ben Lakish said, the verse states, and Jacob called his sons and said, gather and I will tell you what will happen to you at the end of days. Jacob wanted to reveal to his sons when the complete redemption would arrive at the end of days. He wanted to tell his sons and to be recorded for posterity when Mashiach is coming. But the divine presence abandoned him, rendering him unable to prophecy. He said, Jacob that is, perhaps the divine presence has abandoned me because heaven forfend one of my descendants is unfit, as was the case with my grandfather Avram, from whom Yishmael emerged, and like my father Isaac, Yitzchak, from whom Esau emerged. The son said to him, hear Israel, our father, the Lord is our God, the Lord is one, the famous Shema Yisrael. They said, just as there is only one God in your hearts, so too there is only one in our hearts. No, we haven't abandoned the ways of God. And so that can't be the reason why the divine presence left you. At that moment, Jacob, our father, said in praise, blessed be the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever. Parenthetically, this is the reason why, following our saying of the first verse of Shema Yisrael, Hashem Elokeinu, Hashem Echad, we then proceed to say in an undertone, Baruch Shem Kivod Malchusa V'Olam Va'ed, which is the Hebrew of what Jacob responded to his children, saying the Shema, blessed be the name of his glorious kingdom forever and ever. So here we have the story, we still don't have the explanation. Jacob was about to let that big secret out of the bag. He's going to tell them what's happening. He's going to tell them what's going to be. And at last, God says, no, not going to happen. So the question is why? And not just why, but as we've mentioned many times, the Hebrew word Torah means a lesson. If for whatever reason, God did not want Jacob to proceed and to tell his children when Mashiach will come, the day Mashiach will arrive, and he then continued with the blessings, why write it in the Torah in the first place? When he's in the beginning of chapter 49 from Genesis, instead of telling us that he wanted to tell them what's going to happen at the end of the day, so then going on to say that he just went ahead and gave them blessings, skip that part. Don't tell us that he wanted to tell them something at the end of the day, because God didn't want him to. So take that verse out. Why did God find it important to keep that verse in the Torah? And from the other hand, the other side, we know in the Talmud, it tells us the famous statement, tzaddik decrees and God fulfills. When a tzaddik decrees something, God will fulfill it. Here the tzaddik, Jacob, our forefather, wanted to tell them the end of days. Why didn't God allow him to? Why did God hold it back from him and not allow him to say it? And so we must say that the fact that God did not allow him to say what he wanted to say, but nonetheless kept it in the Torah, and knowing that, as the Talmud says, when a tzaddik decrees something, God will fulfill it, this teaches us that, yes, Jacob's intention was fulfilled. Although he didn't manage to blurt out when Mashiach's coming, nonetheless, by telling us this part of the story, Jacob's intention, what he intended to accomplish, was actually accomplished. How is that? In the Rebbe's words, from the fact that the Torah records Jacob's words, gather and I will tell you, we are compelled to conclude that it had some sort of material effect, so much so that it's part of the eternal Torah. If this would not be the case, the Torah would not have recorded for all Jews such an irrelevant thing. Regardless, we are compelled to say so, for we know that a tzaddik's request does not ever come back empty-handed. So Yaakov did accomplish something. Jacob, our forefather, accomplished something by attempting to say it and still not saying it. Nonetheless, he accomplished something. What? What is that something? What's the Messianic era? It's important for us to understand that over here we're talking about the Jewish understanding of what Mashiach is, where all other religions took it from Judaism. And when we talk about Mashiach, or Messiah, the Messianic era, we're talking about the Jewish view, the Torah view of what is Mashiach. What is Mashiach in the Torah view? Mashiach in the Torah view is, as we all know, it's going to be a utopia. Utopian time, there'll be world peace, everyone will be healthy, everyone will be strong, everyone will have whatever they need, prosperity for all, perfect life. What we all dream of and know or think that it's impossible to happen, that's going to happen when Mashiach comes. That's true. All that is true. But that's not really what Mashiach is about. That's going to happen. But there's much more to the story. It's much deeper than that. The primary shift that will be brought about with the coming of Mashiach and the redemption is a spiritual shift. It's a spiritual one. Yes, we enjoy religious freedom in Western society and Western culture. We can go ahead and we can study Torah, we can daven in shul, we can eat kosher. Kosher is easy these days. It's not like it was in the olden days, right? In Russia, it was hard to come by any kosher food in Soviet Russia. Nowadays, it's easy. You walk into any Trader Joe's and you have top of the line kosher meat. Who would ever dream of something like that? So yes, we live in a time where religious freedom is beautiful. But that doesn't tell us that civic life, living in the Western culture, is conducive to spirituality. It isn't. As a matter of fact, it's the exact opposite. It isn't conducive to a spiritual life. If we were just to sit back, left to our own devices, as a human being, what are we attracted to? We're not so attracted to spirituality. Eat, drink, and be merry. That's what we would resort to, because we are animalistic beings to a certain degree. Human beings, we resort to very materialistic things. Spirituality isn't something that comes by easily. We have to work on it, and thankfully we do. We try hard, and in some way or another, we're all spiritually in tune with our souls, but it isn't the way it should. The way it should be is spiritual life is what it's all about. The seismic shift, the wow factor of the Messianic era is this exact idea that the default drive to the material urge will fall away and it'll be transformed to the default drive will be the spiritual urge. The default drive will be godliness of everyone, of the entire universe, of the entire world. It's going to be a spiritual driven world. It's something which is beyond us. We can't even fathom something so great, so transformative. In the words of Maimonides in his final law, in his magnum opus, the Mishnah Torah, Plato says it as follows: in that era, the era of Mashiach, there will be neither famine nor war, envy nor competition, for good will flow in abundance, and all the delights will be freely available as dust. The occupation of the entire world will be solely to know God. Spirituality, that's it, everyone. Therefore, the Jews will be great sages and know the hidden matters, grasping the knowledge of their Creator according to the full extent of human potential. That's what it's all about. It's all about this seismic shift to becoming a spiritual driven urge, a spiritual driven world. All about godliness, all about spirituality. When is that going to happen? Is that going to happen today? Is that going to happen tomorrow? Was it predestined by God when this change, this shift was going to happen? Is there something we can do about it? Did we miss it? Is it really in play and we don't really know about it? When is it going to happen? The Talmud has the answer, or it has somewhat of an answer. I'll let you decide. Here's the Talmud in Tractate Sanhedrin. Rabbi Alexandri says, Rabbi Yeshua ben Levi raises a contradiction. In the verse, it's a verse from Isaiah, I, God, in its time, I will hasten it. It is written in its time, indicating that there is a designated time for the redemption. And it is written in the same verse, I will hasten it, indicating that there is no set time for the redemption. Rabbi Alexandri explains, if they are worthy, I will hasten the coming of Mashiach. If they are not worthy, Mashiach will come in its designated time. What's Rabbi Alexandri explaining? What he's explaining is as follows. Redemption, Mashiach, is the end goal of the universe. It's the reason why God created the world. The goal. It's the mission that we all have, is to reach that end goal and make it a reality. When's Mashiach supposed to come? Now, to clarify, Mashiach is an individual, a person, flesh and blood, a Jew from the Davidic line, who has to be someone who fulfills the entire Torah and all its commandments and works diligently to seal the breaches within Judaism. And it's important to know that it's an actual person. It's not just an era, it's the person, the individual who will be Mashiach will usher in this wonderful era of redemption. Now, when will Mashiach come? When will God appoint Mashiach and say, go and redeem the world? Is it a set time designated by God that it will happen in the year 6,000 from creation? Or can it happen at any day? And so the Talmud puts its verse in Isaiah, which seems to have a contradiction. On the one hand, the verse tells us in Isaiah, in prophecy from Isaiah the prophet, that the time of Mashiach's arrival is predetermined. God has decided that in this and this year, Mashiach will come. There's nothing we can do about it to bring it quicker. It's not that Mashiach is coming today. It's at whatever day God has predetermined. But in that same verse, God says, I will hasten it. It can come earlier than its designated time. Does it have a designated time? Does it not? And so Rabbi Alexandria explains that if they are worthy, then God will bring it before its predestined time. If they are not worthy, Mashiach will definitely come by a certain year, which the sages explain as year 6,000 from creation, and we are currently 5781 since creation. That is the designated time. That is kind of the end time. And that's looking at the world and the time span of creation. Since creation, as every 1,000 years being like a cosmic day. And so currently we are 781 years into the 1,000-year cosmic day of Friday. And so we are almost at Shabbos. Shabbos being a metaphor for the cosmic day of Shabbos being the coming of Mashiach. And so we're pretty close. But nonetheless, the verse tells us that if they're worthy, God will hasten coming of Mashiach. What does it mean to be worthy? Simply put, it's like you tell a child, if you behave nicely, you get a cookie from the cookie jar, right? If the Jews behave nicely, we fulfill the commandments, we do what we're supposed to do, God will give us this reward of Mashiach. But understanding that it's deep, understanding that there is much more at hand than just a reward, just a cookie from the cookie jar, gives us this idea that there's something deeper than it. It's not just a reward. What's going on here? What's at play here is as follows. The reality of the Messianic times that we explained earlier, that seismic shift from the material urge to the spiritual urge, to the entire world only being a spiritual world, that's a tremendous gap. That's a gap that seems unbridgeable, if you will. One that's almost incomprehensible. It's not something we can imagine. How is that possible? Suddenly the world's going to become such a spiritual place. Not just we're going to behave spiritually, but inherently our drive will only be a spiritual drive. We look at it as something which is such a gap. It's a gap which is way beyond anything we can imagine. And so this gap is partially responsible for the amount of time that has lapsed, the amount of time that we have already waited for it to happen because we fail to see how we can ever reach it. It's beyond us. It seems to be way far removed from what we experience today. How do we bridge that gap? We bridge that gap. We cure this feeling of lack of comprehension on how to have such a shift. How can we do that? When we behave in a manner that is more in sync with the Messianic reality. When we act, when we perform our day-to-day service of God, when we go about our day in a more Mashiach manner, in a more spiritual manner, in a manner where we make ourselves better people. We try to influence ourselves, our immediate surroundings, and our greater surroundings, the world around us, in order to make it all a better place. We are doing what? We are now preparing the world for the coming of Mashiach because we are now trying to live as if we are in a Mashiach reality. So if we make as if we are living in a Mashiach reality, we try to be more in sync with what a Mashiach reality is, even though we're not there yet. that will hasten the coming of Mashiach. And that's what Rabbi Alexandria is telling us, worthy. More worthy means we try to behave in a Mashiach reality way. We go about our day with that Mashiach consciousness. We go about our life trying to influence the world for the good, because that's what will be when Mashiach comes. So let's start making it a reality today. Once we start making it a reality today, we'll actually see how bridging that gap is possible. And it will actually bridge that gap. In other words, the affirmative action that we take to be more Mashiach-like actually brings Mashiach closer. So when we say that if they are worthy, I will hasten the coming of Mashiach, it means let's be more Mashiach-like. And that will bring Mashiach closer. And this is exactly getting back to the story of Yaakov, of Jacob. This is what Jacob was trying to do. What Jacob was attempting to do is, I want to bridge that gap. I see that ahead is going to be tough times. There's going to be exile. But you know what? Even if there's going to be exile, if my children know that there is a concrete end, there is a day that Mashiach will arrive, it's not just something in the abstract. It's not just something which is outlandish. It's something of a reality. There is a day set that Mashiach will come. And listen up, kids. This is the day that Mashiach will come. Yaakov felt that bridges the gap to making Mashiach not just a unfathomable reality, an unfathomable dream, to a more plausible reality. And that will enable his children to work harder. That will enable his children to try to live their life, and their children after them to try to live their life more Mashiach-like, to hasten the coming of Mashiach even earlier than it is designated to. But God said no. Why did God say no? Many, many different answers. One short answer. God said no simply because here we are thousands of years after Jacob was speaking to his children. In other words, the day that Jacob would have told his children would have been thousands of years off. If his children would have heard, you know what, there are thousands of years before Mashiach's coming. It's not so exciting. Yes, it's a plausible reality, but it will kind of take the air out of the excitement. It'll give them the strong feeling of despondency. And God said, no, I don't want that to happen. But nonetheless, the Torah shares with us that he attempted to. Why? So we do know that there is an end goal. We do know that it's not only plausible, it's possible, and it will happen. There's an actual end goal. And the more we act Mashiach-like, the quicker we'll reach that end goal. Understanding this idea about Mashiach, understanding this concept, now we can get back to the question that we asked at the beginning of the class. Why is Mashiach a fundamental principle? Why Mashiach is a fundamental principle is because now that we've just explained about Yaakov, Jacob, and what he told his children, and we explained that to not only really believe in Mashiach, but to hasten its arrival is to live a Mashiach-like life, is to perceive Mashiach as a reality in life today and act accordingly. When we operate our life on such a level, our entire religious experience is enhanced. Not just some narrow aspect, but our entire religious observance, our entire religious life is affected. And that is why Maimonides calls it a fundamental principle, foundational principle of Judaism. What does that mean? It means as follows. The Say the story of the dad who has two children. One son is a tremendous optimist. Nothing gets him down, nothing at all. And the other son is the exact opposite. Tremendous pessimist, nothing gets him up. He's always looking at the bad side of things. We all know those pessimists in our life. They're always explaining how they're not pessimists, they're really, really realists, but pessimists. So this dad has these two sons, elementary, fifth graders, twins. They each have their own room. And the dad decides, you know what? When they come home today from school, I'm going to teach them a lesson. I will make the pessimist be excited about life and the optimist sad about life, pessimistic. And so that goes in the optimist's room, goes ahead and orders truckloads of horses' stuff. Put it cleanly. And he just dumps it in the kid's room. It stinks to the high heavens, full of manure. The whole room is just stuffed. In the optimist's room. The pessimist's room takes his credit card. It's got $30,000 limit on it. And he just cleans out Apple, Toys R Us, every store you can imagine of every new gadget. He's got the PS5 and he's got the iPads and iPhones and iPods and you name it, he's got it, and the newest gadgets, and he stuffs it in the pessimist room. Kids come home from school, dad is excited, he's going to teach them each a lesson, but there's a different way of looking at life. And he goes in, he sends the kids to their room. Half hour later, he decides he's going to start with the pessimist. He comes into the pessimist room, and lo and behold, the kid is sitting in the middle of a pile of ripped open boxes, and he's crying. He's crying his eyes out. And dad says, what happened? You got every single gadget. And the kid says, Dad, yes, but you know how many manuals I'm going to have to read. You know how many batteries I'm going to have to charge and change. And you know how many boxes I'm going to have to fold up and put in the trash. He says, this is a nightmare. That figures, all right, I failed miserably at this one, but you know what? With the optimist, no way I failed. Comes to the optimist room, he opens the door, and the kid is bouncing off the walls from joy. It smells, it's a horrible sight, and the kid is over the moon with excitement. And Dad says, what is going on here? What are you so excited about? He says, with all this manure here, there's got to be a pony in here somewhere. So we all know the pessimists and optimists in our life. What do the pessimists say? What do the optimists say? The optimists say, look where we've come. It's 2020. Life is great. Yes, there's a few hiccups in the world, but you know what? If you look at the greater picture, deaths from wars are down tremendously from the way they used to be back in the 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th century. Infant deaths and sicknesses, life expectancy is so much longer than it used to be. So if you look at it from the greater picture, it's much rosier than some people would like us to. And then there's the pessimists. Pessimists, what are you talking about? Life expectancy went backwards this year. Okay, by a few days. Life expectancy went backwards this year. There's a pandemic. We thought the economy was getting better, and look how it crashed, and it's getting worse. There's so many unemployed, and life is terrible. Life is terrible. Why even bother in the first place trying to work hard on the economy? Because it's anyhow going to crash at some point. Look at life the past 100 years. It started building up and then it crashed with the Great Depression. It started building up again and crashed with the Second World War. It started building up again, crashed in the 80s. Why bother? Why bother trying to make the world a better place? It's terrible. It's always going to hit rock bottom at some point. I'm going to go hit up the bar. You can come drink with me. That's it. That's what the pessimist says. And this pessimistic outlook, who says, what's the point of it all? Why even bother trying to do something good if it's going to end up negative? This cynical worldview is actually put quite succinctly by the Alter Rebbe in his book, the Tanya. The world and all that fills it is called the world of evil, of klipa. Indeed, the modus operandi of the world is evil and harsh. The wicked reign supreme. That's it. We live in a terrible world. Life is terrible. Dictators are always going to be here. They're always going to destroy the world for us. No matter how much we try, it's always going to end up rock bottom. Why even bother? I'm going back to my bottle. Going back to drink my beer. How do we tell someone like this? cheer up. It's going to be better. It gets better. Yes, it seems like we've hit a rough patch, but it's just that. It's a rough patch because you know what? The end will be good. What do we tell them? So Torah tells us, tell them that Mashiach's coming. Tell them that Mashiach's coming. The verses in Deuteronomy. Then the Lord your God will bring back your exiles, and he will have mercy upon you. He will once again gather you from all the nations where the Lord your God had dispersed you. It's not all's not lost. Yes, there seems to be a rough patch, but you know what? At the end, it's all going to be good. Even if your exiles are at the end of the heavens, the Lord your God will gather you from there, and he will take you from there. And the Lord your God will bring you to the land which your forefathers possessed, and you too will take possession of it. And he will do good to you, and he will make you more numerous than your forefathers. It's quite rosy. It gets better. The Mashiach era is a message of hope to someone who sees the pessimistic aspect of the world, always sees what's wrong, always sees how terrible the world is headed. Look what's happening here, look what's happening there. It's all terrible. It's going to get better. You know what? That's very nice. But what happens? What does a pessimist say? That's all great. Mashiach's going to come. Hang on, people. In the end, it's all going to be wonderful. But how about now? How about now? That's going to be in a long time from now. That's what the pessimist will say. All right, in however long it's going to be. One day things will get better. All right, one day things will get better. Meanwhile, I'm back to the bar. Back to the bar with my bottle. I'm done. So what do we tell this person? And really, we have that person to a certain degree inside each one of us. We all have that aspect of pessimism. We all have that inner voice that tells us, yes, we've been waiting for Mashiach so long. And yes, things will get better at the end, but how about now? What's there to uplift me now? And this is the message which Yaakov was telling his children, and why it's so critical, and why Maimonides keeps it as a fundamental aspect of me. What Yaakov was telling his children, that Mashiach's arrival isn't predestinated. Predestined. Mashiach's arrival is hastened by our efforts to bring him closer. God has determined the date for his arrival. And who knows, maybe that date may be far off, but that doesn't matter. Because engineered into this whole game, engineered into this whole goal seeking of Mashiach is this idea that through our living like Mashiach times, like the Mashiach era, will hasten Mashiach's arrival. So it's far from an abstract thing. It's not something which is far away. It's not something which has no relation to us. Every time we do something good, every time we do a mitzvah, every single time we pick up the pieces after they've fallen apart, we are the very person making the goodness we so desperately seek an immediate reality. By you doing that mitzvah, by you lighting Shabbos candles, by you putting on tefillin, by you studying Torah for 5 minutes, by us studying Torah here tonight, we are picking up those pieces. We are making them the dream of Mashiach a reality. It's not something abstract. It's something current. It's something that we have a finger in, and we got to do it the best way we possibly can. Back to the Alter Rebbe in the book of Tanya. The universal perfection of Mashiach and the resurrection of the dead, which is the manifestation of godly revelation in this world, are directly hinged upon the work we invest during exile. It's directly hinged on what we do in exile. The more we do, the faster he will come. The more we do, the earlier he will come. The more we do, the quicker we will hasten the coming of Mashiach, the star of perfection. That should get those pessimists going. That should get us going. To believe in Mashiach is not believe that God will bring Mashiach in a far off time. To believe Mashiach is when I live Mashiach-like, Mashiach will come faster at any moment, because I'm going to live my life as Mashiach-like as possible. The words of the Rebbe. It's readily apparent when a Jew really appreciates that their religious observance actually hastens Mashiach's arrival and the rebuilding of the temple of Beis HaMikdash. When a Jew really gets that his or her actions literally bring the entire world to its very purpose, namely the mission statement of creating a home for God, then their religious observance is suffused with an entirely different energy and so much more passion and meticulousness. And these very efforts hasten the final redemption for all Jews, namely, the redemption arrives immediately. Now we know why Mashiach is on that short list of things which are foundational in Judaism. Here we are in exile. Here we are in exile for thousands of years. It's a daily struggle. Mashiach is not a distant hope. It's a daily struggle. And by knowing that Mashiach is not a distant hope, this gives us strength, this gives us courage and energy to live an optimistic life, knowing that by us, me, you, each one of us, doing another mitzvah, as Maimonides says, that will be the mitzvah that makes the world as Mashiach-like as possible during exile and brings about the final redemption. There's an inner battle, there's a struggle, it's going to happen, there's going to be ups and downs in the world. It has happened in the past, and God willing, Mashiach will come tonight. So it won't happen again, but God forbid Mashiach doesn't come and it will happen again. The good news is we can still condition ourselves to live Mashiach-like, to hasten his coming by doing one moment. And if we know there's something we can do about it, we can never sit back and relax and say, let's hit the bar. Because it's not far off. Because the more I do, the sooner it will be. Easier said than done to have this outlook, to live Mashiach like nowadays. How do we condition ourselves to live such a life? By studying about Mashiach. You go to Williamsburg, Virginia, they have an entire colony there. It's like the years, this late 18th century, foundation of the United States. And there's people that act up like George Washington and act up like the revolutionary soldiers and so on and so forth. Those people, especially the ones that do most of the talking, how can they live a life as if they are those characters? Because they've studied the books. They know what those people thought like those days. They lived like those days. And so they condition themselves to be able to live as if they are living in those times. How do we condition ourselves to live like a Mashiach life? The more we study about Mashiach. The more we study about Mashiach, about the Messianic era, about what we're supposed to do to hasten the coming of Mashiach, or what the world's going to be like when Mashiach comes, the more we study about Mashiach, the easier it'll become that Mashiach is less of a concept and more of a reality. The easier it'll become for us to live a Mashiach life. And here's an interesting metaphor taught by Rabbi Yoel Khan, who's a renowned teacher of Hasidic thought and philosophy. He lives in Crown Heights. And he once told this metaphor. To give a metaphor, imagine that a soldier in the middle of a war would get up and say, I'm not interested in finding out why we're being told to shoot. All I know is that I must follow orders. Think about such a soldier, on one who doesn't know that his efforts actually repel the enemy and contribute to victory. It's obvious that though he may follow orders to a T, he will lack a certain morale, and you can bet that at some point it will impact his performance. Eventually, he won't fight as he should. The same is true with our mission as a Jew to follow the Torah. A Jew simply cannot say that they don't care to know how or why their efforts bring about the much hoped for victory. A Jew absolutely must know that there is indeed a war at stake, a battle between the forces of good and evil, and it is our job to win this war. A Jew must know that every additional mitzvah they do introduces more godly energy into this world and brings us closer to victory, Obviously, the victory you're talking about here is the victory of Mashiach. What's more, a Jew must be confident that ultimately we will win. After all, the victory is the very purpose of creation, and it's impossible for that goal not to be realized. A day later, a day earlier, eventually, good will prevail. This very knowledge inspires and energizes a Jew to muster even more determination. And it's not only a day earlier, a day later, good will prevail, but the more we fight with the correct intentions, the faster that victory will arrive. The previous Rebbe stated that when soldiers go out to war, they must come out of the gate with a victory march. From the outset, a soldier must go with a mindset that victory is his. When he does, he fights with added vigor and dedication. And thus, believing in Mashiach is fundamental to our faith. A Jew must know that at the end of the day, the Jewish people are going to win this war. Not just that we are destined to self-determination and freedom to serve God, but so much more that Mashiach will, in fact, steer the entire world to serve God, bringing about the absolute and eternal rule of God. And so belief in Mashiach is the fundamental foundation of our faith, because with it, we are able to fulfill every single mitzvah with added vigor and added determination, knowing that every mitzvah that we do hastens the coming of Mashiach. May the coming of Mashiach be speedily in our days.